Well, good morning, everybody. Ooh, I think I'm a little loud. Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you that suddenly. Welcome to our class. We're continuing our study of gospel personages, and we're doing our third lesson on Peter today. I'm not sure that Peter ever realized that he would demand 3 weeks of our study, but I hope it's been beneficial. It's been meaningful for me. I hope it has been beneficial for you. Today we're dealing with that incident that I think that strikes us perhaps as the most impressive thing about Peter, because we see his weaknesses clearly evident, and then we see a strength that survives. This is such an important incident in the life of Peter. All 4 Gospels recorded. That's not true of many incidents, but this one is. As I began preparation for it, I thought about an incident that occurred to me when I was dean of students. One day I was asked to preside in chapel, and our speaker for that day was a former student body president of the college, a young man that I knew fairly well. So I got to introduce him. And in my introduction, I said of him, and I meant it sincerely, this is a young man that I've never been disappointed by. And we went on, and he spoke, and everything was fine. But a little bit later, Halloween rolled around. I had to be out of town on the night of Halloween, and deans of students are very popular on Halloween night. So I said to the then president of the student body, I'd appreciate it if you'd run by the house a couple of times tonight just to check on Shirley and the kids, make sure that everything's all right. It was. I got home, and Shirley said nothing had happened, and got back to school a couple of days later, and the president of the student body came by, and he said, Doc, I'm sorry, but I forgot to go. I said, well, things turned out okay. He said, but you will never introduce me in chapel as somebody who never disappointed you. I said, that's probably right. Disappointments are hard things to deal with. And I think this is an episode in which Jesus was gravely disappointed. He'd spent 3 years trying to train a group of men, hoping that he would maintain some loyalty with them, but they disappointed him. It's not the only time Jesus was disappointed. We all know that. Surely he was disappointed because his brothers didn't believe in him. Surely he was disappointed because Nazareth turned against him and tried to stone him. And that's pretty obvious. He was disappointed because Judas betrayed him. Peter denied him. Thomas doubted him. And the list could go on and on of people that Jesus somehow expected something a little better from. And it didn't happen. And I couldn't help wondering, as we think about this context of Peter and his relationship to Jesus, number one, who's disappointed me? But number two, whom have I disappointed? There are times when we find our feelings are hurt because somebody didn't quite do or say what we thought they would do or say, and our feelings are hurt. But the reverse of that can happen too, because I may have said the wrong thing or done the wrong thing, and I disappointed somebody else. How responsible am I for that? Is it my job to follow up on that and say, I made a grievous mistake and I'm so sorry, I hope you'll forgive me? Peter didn't do that, but Jesus forgave him anyway. So it's from that aspect that I want us to look at the lesson today and see what we can learn from Peter and his denial. Actually, there are 3 denials as we have them in the text. So we begin reading from John chapter 13. We have 3 readings, and so we'll get the first one. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I'll lay down my life for your sake. Jesus answered him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you denied me 3 times. This takes place in the period when Jesus begins to talk to his disciples about the time that is coming when he will leave them. And Peter wants to know why he can't go with him. In John chapter 14, the next chapter, we have that very familiar passage when Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, and so in my Father's house. And then he says, where I'm going you know, and the way you know. And Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you're going, and how do we know the way? And Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. He was trying to condition them to the reality of his departure. But they were having a hard time dealing with the fact that here are all the things he's been doing for these 3 or so years, the remarkable things he'd been doing, and now he's leaving, and they can't go with him. How do they sort all that out? You and I have a great advantage because we know the rest of the New Testament. We know what Jesus is talking about. We know about life after his resurrection, life after his ascension, life in the church. All those kinds of things become very important for us. And now we understand where he was going, and we understand how we can get there. But a lot of that was so highly condensed for the disciples, they just couldn't quite sort it all out. They could not figure out exactly where they fit into the picture. Somebody said Peter is consistently inconsistent. He has ranged all the way from his, what I think are kind of the highlights of his early life. He's moved away from those times when he said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. To whom shall we go? Only you have the words of life. And as he says in this text, I'm ready to die for your sake. Those are highlights in Peter's life. Here's a man who confesses he's the Christ. That was a major confession because that's what the people had to learn. He was the Messiah. What they had anticipated, prayed for, looked forward to is here. And Peter acknowledged that. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Or his acknowledgement, there's nobody else who teach us about eternal life but you. Only you have the words of eternal life. And then this last one, I'm ready to die for your sake. This precedes a little bit the place where Jesus will say, greater love has no man than a man would lay down his life for his friends. Peter must have been anticipating that kind of belief. I'm ready to die for your sake. And all of those sound wonderful, and they speak of Christian courage. They speak of faithful devotion. We just know Peter wasn't consistent with them. He was consistently inconsistent. And Jesus predicted the time will come. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. How's Peter going to live with that blot on his past? If it is true, as we believe and tradition says, if it is true that Peter was the greatest source for Mark's account of the gospel, later in 2 Peter, he will acknowledge his connection with John Mark. If Peter was his greatest source of information, don't you wonder how he felt when he said, Mark, I hate to tell you, but there was a night when I did something very foolish and very cowardly. I denied Jesus. And he had to explain that whole story so Mark could write it down in his account of the life of Jesus. That had to be a rough time. And either he didn't tell Mark about the episode we're going to read from John 21, or Mark didn't record it. We don't have that account when we believe Jesus forgave Peter. But how does one deal with that kind of blot on his past? In John 13, Jesus says, Peter asks, where are you going? That's not the only time in the Gospels when somebody questions Jesus about where he's going. In the very first chapter of John, Andrew, and we assume it was John with him, said, Lord, where are you living? Where you dwell? And he said, why don't you come see? The ability to go with him, be with him. John even records how much time those 2 men spent with him that day. When Peter said, I would die for your sake, I'd like to believe he really meant that. That's a kind of hyperbole. That's one of those things that's little exaggerated. We hope it won't ever happen. I think secretly he was saying, I will lie for you, because he's going to do that. There's a lot of difference between dying and lying. Peter willingly lied for the Savior. Didn't help Jesus at all. But I will lie for you. I'd look to see how many times roosters are mentioned in the Bible. Not very often. King James Version calls them all cocks. So you got a different word there. But it's just kind of interesting. Something very domestic enters this picture. We know that for people many times the rooster was their alarm clock. It was morning when the rooster crowed. Unless he got out of whack with daylight saving time and crowed at the wrong time. This morning as we were waking, Shirley said the alarm didn't go off. I said, I know, I forgot to set it last night. I don't know whether I was living in hope or expectation or what, but Peter didn't have to worry that that rooster would keep time very easily. And so we turn to the Matthew passage, Matthew 26. This is where the rubber meets the road. Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him saying, you also are with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied it before them all, saying, I don't know what you're saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you. And then he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered. He remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So he went out and wept bitterly. In this period, Peter kind of follows the crowd. We have no evidence he was ever at the cross. According to the records we have in the Gospels, John was the only apostle who was there. Peter didn't follow him to the cross, but the night before he followed him on these trials. And it's interesting that Matthew begins by saying Peter was outside in the courtyard. Not in the middle of the action, and maybe he wanted to be, but he couldn't be. He's outside. And it's interesting, 2 servant girls pay particular attention. Servants always knew a whole lot more about what was going on than some people thought they did, because they saw, they heard. And she says concerning Peter, you were with Jesus of Galilee, and notice the emphasis on Galilee. Remember, can anything good come out of Nazareth? You're with this man from Galilee who was highly suspicious down in Jerusalem. And he denied, though, before them all, I do not know what you're saying. I don't know why you would accuse me. I don't have any connection with him. I don't know why you're saying what you are. And so he moved. Then he goes to the gateway, the entrance into and outside the walls of this complex where the high priest lived. Moved to a different setting. It's kind of like, okay, they're going to talk about me here. I'll go somewhere else. Well, another servant girl comes along, and she says, you also were with Jesus of Nazareth. He swore with an oath. Language gets stronger each time. I do not know the man. This is the man of whom he said, or to whom he said, you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now it's, I don't know that man. He moves a little farther, and some others in the crowd say to him, surely you were with him. We move from an oath to cursing and swearing. he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. I couldn't help wondering if by this point Peter returns to his salty speech of the sea, kind of language that rough fishermen might have used. He had a vocabulary that maybe for the last 2 years, 3 years, had been quelled, but now it comes to the fore. He's under pressure, under peer pressure. He's around people who know what his identity was like, what his personality was like. Cursing and swearing. This is the man that we admire. This is the man we're grateful for other reasons, but this is the low point of his life. Cursing and swearing, returning to a language he probably once used with abandon. Been a part of his personal life. Peter succumbed to that peer pressure, to be like the people around him, to be accepted. We talk to teenagers about that all the time. Be careful about just following the crowd so they'll accept you. Why don't you get them to accept what you are? Don't succumb to peer pressure. I think it's later, and it's interesting that much later, Peter must have written about this event in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 4. He said concerning the people of the world, they think it's strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. That had happened to Peter. He'd been around a crowd that thought he'd just go back to his old way of life. And he warns first century Christians, be careful. There are going to be people who are going to wonder why you don't return to the same dissipation you once knew. Where is this change evident? Paul is the one who likes to say that we're raised to walk in newness of life, and we become a new creation. That means we don't go back to what we once were. I was an early teen, probably 13, 14 years old, when a young man 2 or 3 years older than I was baptized one Sunday. Later that afternoon, I was riding around in the car with him, and I was shocked when he came out with some profanity. And I thought, well, baptism didn't take, did it? He had not changed. He was the same person he was before. Maybe I was making a hasty judgment, but I thought I was expecting a whole new vocabulary from him. Peter hadn't lost his old vocabulary either. He still had access to it. They think it's strange. Why? Why don't you do what you did before? Run with us to the same dissipation. He says to the Christians, they'll speak evil of you. You're going to be subject to. And Peter knew that, firsthand experience. So we watch him as he moves in the midst of this crowd, and we finally see him in that third response, standing before a fire. It's evident that it's cool, it's the middle of the night, people are trying to get warm, but you need to think about whose fire am I warming by? What crowd has drawn me to their group? What happens to Peter at this point becomes kind of ordinary and predictable. And the Bible says when the rooster crowed, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Didn't say anything. Nothing's recorded. It's just like, I told you so. I don't think he said that with any, or thought that with any glee or satisfaction. But I can't think of something more impressive than to know that Jesus turned and looked at him. And Luke says he went out and wept bitterly. What happens when I've been caught in a sin? What happens when others know that I've betrayed an allegiance? Jesus is looking, and I can only weep. So he did. We sometimes sing the song "In the Hour of Trial." And a part of that song has the line, "When thou seest me waver, with a look recall." When you see me stepping aside, wavering in my walk with Jesus, I need somebody, particularly the Lord, with a look, call me back to my first allegiance. With a look, recall. I think I know where the songwriter got that idea. So we find a weeping apostle. I have no doubt that Jesus still loved Peter. He had already said to him earlier that evening, "Simon, Simon, Satan has desired to have you that he may sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith fail not. And when you are converted, strengthen your brothers." Jesus had some expectations for Peter. He is aware that he is subject to temptation. Satan is after you. Isn't it interesting? The same apostle to whom Jesus said, "Satan wants you," will later write, "Be sober, be vigilant. Your adversary, like a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour." Peter knew that experience. He knew when Satan came after him, and he warned others. You see, I really think it's interesting to read 1st and 2nd Peter in comparison with the Gospels, because you see incidents in which Peter carries over into his letters things that surely reflect events in his own life, and that was one of them. I have prayed for you. I've said before, I can't think of anything more powerful and more moving than to believe that Jesus is praying for me, that my name is called before the throne of heaven by the Son of God. I have prayed for you. And what he prayed for, that your faith will not fail. That night in the trials, Peter's faith failed. And so 3 times he denied Jesus. Secondly, he prayed that once you're finally converted, once you've really changed, strengthen your brothers. Don't forget other people will also be subject to some of the same weaknesses that you will experience. Strengthen your brothers. And then we go to our third incident, recorded in John chapter 21. This is a few days later after the resurrection. And Peter says to some of the other men, there were 7 of them altogether, "I'm going fishing." We've talked about that before as being just a sense of some normalcy. What did we do before Jesus came? What did we do before we became involved with him? I'm going fishing. Here's all this time on my hands, and I'm distressed, and I feel somewhat abandoned. I certainly don't know what's going on. I'm going fishing. And the others say, "We'll go with you." And they go out and they fish all night, and they caught absolutely nothing. If they were expecting that to be a night to sort of restore their confidence in their profession or in their ability, they didn't get it. And as sunrise approached, isn't it interesting, this also happened at sunrise, just like the Niles did. As sunrise approached, they see Jesus walking on the shore. And John recognized him. It's the Lord. And Jesus said, "Do you have any fish?" "No, we've fished all night, didn't catch anything." And he said, "Put your net on the other side." And they brought in an enormous haul. And Jesus said, "Bring some of those fish ashore." And he had built a fire. He prepared breakfast for them. I don't think this is as moving and totally comparable to the time Jesus knelt and washed their feet, but he's serving them again, just as he did that night. He's teaching them the importance of thinking of others and doing for others his breakfast prepared. And in the midst of that meal, he turns all of his attention to Peter. So when they'd eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." We'll stop there for a second. What an intriguing conversation. Not the sort of thing you expect after breakfast early one morning. Sometimes breakfast could bring out the craziest thoughts in people's heads, and here are these questions. But 3 times, "Do you love me?" And you'll notice that in the first one, Jesus said, "Do you love me more than these?" There's been some discussion about what's the these. Does it mean you love me more than you love these other fellows that are around here with you? Or do you love me more than the job of fishing, all the things you've spent your life on? Doesn't much matter. The importance is, do you love me? And each time Peter responds with, "Lord, you know I love you." Well, where was the evidence? Denials, 3 of them, were no evidence of love, that's for sure. And now, to follow up 3 denials, there have to be 3 affirmations. Do you love me? Lord, you know I love you. I think that's wishful thinking on Peter's part. I hope you know that I love you. Jesus said you need to show that. And he gives him the responsibility of tending or feeding my sheep. And with the picture Jesus gives us in John 10 of himself as the good shepherd, and his sheep are those who follow him, there's Peter's job. Feed my sheep. And then Jesus concludes, "I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not want, or where you do not wish." And John inserts, "This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, 'Follow me.'" Jesus gives us a little picture of what the future's like for Peter. He reminds him that when he was younger, he was healthy and strong and full of bravado, and he did what he wanted to, and he went where he wanted to. But when you're old, that will not always be the case. When you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will guide you and will gird you and carry you where you do not wish to go. Most of us have had some of that experience with age. We don't do what we used to do. We don't go where we used to go. We don't make plans too far in the distance. There are changes we have to adapt to. And John says he was signifying the kind of death Peter would have. The story is that Peter, as he grew older, was under a great deal of pressure, was finally threatened with crucifixion, vowed he did not think himself worthy to die the same way his Lord died, and requested that he be crucified head downward. But death would come. And then Jesus concludes, "Follow me." The last words that we have recorded to Peter are very much like the first words recorded that he said to Peter, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." That's the real responsibility. Making sure that I'm walking in the steps of Jesus, following his path, following his word, perceiving and appreciating his guidance. That's what's so important. I think, again, as Peter was writing his 2 letters, he must have recalled this incident when he chose to write in 1 Peter chapter 4. Love covers a multitude of sins. Peter's already confessed to Jesus, Lord, depart from me, I'm a sinful man. The night of his denials, his sins increased at least by 3. But later he could look back. Love covers a multitude of sins. While Jesus was asking Peter to confess his love for the Lord was confessing his love to Peter by offering his forgiveness. When we think of the accomplishments of Peter following this event, we think of the fact that he preached the first sermon on the day of Pentecost. Powerful sermon, effective sermon. He later was given the privilege of preaching to the house of Cornelius, responsible for the first converts, Gentile converts. Was very much involved in the affairs and activities of the first century church. Wrote 2 letters. Was himself an elder in the church. Suffered a great many trials and ultimately died for his faith. He rose from this low point, but this is a low point in Peter's life. So what do you and I gain from it? Well, I think number one, we have to remember that in whatever stage we think we are as the followers of Jesus, there are always some weak places. And Peter's weak place came out of fear, uncertainty, fearful of what could happen to him. Here was Jesus, who had been just a few days before hailed as he'd made his triumphal entry to Jerusalem, and now he's being beaten and mocked and sentenced to death. Peter knew that could happen to him too. So he was fearful. He was doubtful. Could he stand up to it? And then somewhere the human part of him just took hold. Why do people lie? They're scared of the truth. They don't want to be found out. When I was in the dean's office, Lucinda made for me a little needlepoint thing that I hung in my office in a very conspicuous place. It said, "Tell the truth, then you don't have to remember anything." That was correct. When you start lying, you have to remember what I say. I love the story of the high school teacher who had 4 old boys who cut her class, and they came in late, explained to her that they had a tire go flat and they couldn't get back. She said, "Well, we're doing a little pop quiz right now. Just get out a piece of paper, number 1 to 10. First question, which tire was flat?" They didn't agree on that before they went in. She got some interesting answers. Why do people lie? Somebody says it's easier to lie sometimes than tell the truth. We're trying to protect ourselves, and that's always dangerous. I think I've always been frightened a great deal by the passage in Revelation that says all liars will have their part in the lake of fire and brimstone. Don't think God thinks too kindly of those who lie. But here was Peter lying with vehemence. Notice the intensity. First an oath, I vow. Then cursing and swearing. I don't know that man. Jesus said, you said no 3 times. Now say yes 3 times. Do you love me? I think those are things that matter to us, that should matter to us. So what do we gain from Peter? Well, there's enough here to give us at least 3 lessons from Peter. We're not through with him. We'll move on, but all of us will come back at one time or another to look at Peter again, at Peter in the book of Acts, Peter in 1st and 2nd Peter. those wonderful references there. Even Paul's reference to him a couple of times, always calling him Cephas. Peter's going to have a little thread that runs all the way through the New Testament. A little more prominent in the Gospels and in Acts. And then when Paul takes over his part of the New Testament, Peter kind of backs away for a while, but he comes back. This is a man that Jesus spent a great deal of time trying to win. He prayed for him. He washed his feet. He forgave him. No wonder Peter is so much in admiration of Jesus in his later life and in the letters that he wrote. Thank you very much for being in our class today.